Today's speaker for the Leadership Forum series is Rachel Mosher-Williams. Rachel is the Senior Director for Learning and Impact with Community Wealth Partners in Washington, D.C. Community Wealth Partners is an organization that works with their constituency groups around strategic planning, capacity building, collaborative and partnership development. And she has been very near and dear to my heart because we met over a decade ago, I think, in the beginning when there were only two of us in the Center on Community Philanthropy. And she was willing to work with us and help us to build our capacity around the work that we do now. So please join me in welcoming Rachel.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored to be here, and I have only been in Little Rock for, I don't know, not even 24 hours, and I have absolutely loved it. I have to tell you that when I was walking down the street, I could feel my blood pressure going down. I live in DC, and it was just like, so thank you. Everyone here has been just incredibly welcoming and friendly. And before I get started, I just want to do a big thanks to my hosts here today, including Dr. Llewellyn Williams, her whole team at the Center on Community Philanthropy, Kent, Kevin, Reggie, Leandra, Jose, and special thank you to Bob G back there in the back here. Give a little wave. Bob gave me a wonderful tour of the Clinton Library yesterday, and it's just, you've all been so welcoming. Thank you so much. I also want to give a quick thanks to my colleague back in DC, Lori Valerio, who helped me with this cool presentation. I'm not this cool. You'll see there's some neat images in here, and I'm definitely not this cool. So thank you to Lori for her help with that. It was awesome. So today I'm going to talk to you about my favorite subject, learning and evaluation. And in particular, I want to share some thoughts about how you can be a learning superhero, as you can tell by my Lego thing. So I'd love to start with a story about how learning can bring a lot of power to an organization in seeking greater impact. Share Our Strength is a U.S. nonprofit focusing on ending childhood hunger across the country. It's actually also our parent organization. We are a subsidiary of Share Our Strength. And several years ago, Share Our Strength found itself in kind of an odd position. By a lot of measures, it was doing well. It was really hitting great targets in terms of getting resources to the feeding programs it was supporting. It was getting positive press about how it was funding those feeding programs. And it just had this feeling that it was really moving the needle on childhood hunger. And then it took a step back and it looked at the data out in the environment, and they realized that not only was childhood hunger not decreasing, it was actually increasing while they were working. And that was a really difficult time for them. But what they did is they took the opportunity to learn more deeply why that was the case. What they discovered was, when they dug into the data and they did some evaluation of their own, was actually that the reason that that childhood hunger was probably increasing had more to do with the fact that people were not as likely to access existing good programs that were out there because of the stigma associated with poverty and hunger. So the organization created a campaign called No Kid Hungry. It completely shifted its strategy, and it focused on helping programs and organizations across the country really work on overcoming that stigma. So that's an example of what I believe is really key to long-term change on all of the big issues that we're all working on. I mean, most of us are working on issues that are big and hard and take a long time and a lot of heart and soul. And I think the key to that really is dedicated learning and adaptation over time. Once Share Our Strength, No Kid Hungry really took on that learning mindset, they continued to be disciplined and curious about what was going on outside in the world. And in particular, there's a quote that Billy Shore, who's the founder of the organization, likes to talk about as sort of a guiding inspiration for him, which is, pick battles big enough to matter, but small enough to win. I'll let you read that just for a moment. So I think it's funny, maybe you guys don't, because I'm an evaluation nerd, but I wonder how many out in the audience actually find themselves feeling that way about evaluation and learning? Does that come up for you? I've been there, so I know that feeling that, evaluation and learning can often feel like something you're required to do. It often feels like an unfunded mandate. It can feel like something you just kind of have to get past so you can keep on going. But I want to think with you just a little bit about what evaluation is and then what learning and evaluation can be. So evaluation is critical. Obviously, I love evaluation. That's what I do in my work. But it allows us to step back and really understand, did what we expect to happen with this program or this effort or this model, did that actually happen? Why did it happen? How is it going still? What do we need to do differently? So evaluation is a critical part of a process for any nonprofit, and I'm assuming that if you're in a nonprofit or foundation or any kind of a program, you've had to do some kind of assessment about how things are going. The challenge is that it tends to be, as I sort of visualize here, it tends to be a little bit post-mortem. You do something, then you say, oh, we got to collect some information, we got to look backwards, and we got to decide what happened and why. But I want to suggest that an integrated learning practice that uses evaluation as a tool can allow there to be sort of added to an organization a much greater ongoing cycle of learning, reflection, and adaptation. It can sort of make you more of a powerhouse in sort of thinking about internally how are you evolving to meet the needs of your constituents, and externally what impact are you making. So as I've sort of demonstrated here, what an integrated learning practice can help you do is really create feedback loops. They're not loops, they're kind of triangles, but if you get the idea, they're sort of feedback loops that span programs, it can span time, it can span even people leave organizations. And so when you have an ongoing series of feedback loops that can be informed by evaluation or just informed by a program team's regular consideration of what's going on in their work, it can really just create a totally different story for your organization. I want to just share, I recently had the opportunity to talk to Reagan Moffat, who's at Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. Is anybody from Winthrop Rockefeller here today? All right, representing in the house. Thanks for coming. Winthrop Rockefeller really sort of underwent a little bit of an exploration about its internal learning practice. And it's a really interesting story. I think it's an interesting story. The foundation knew it had good relationships with grantees. It valued partnerships and collaboration. But they had this nagging concern that even though they felt like they were really moving the needle on outcomes for Arkansans, they didn't actually know it. So they didn't have a practice that was confirming to them that was actually happening and happening in an ongoing way. So what they did, and I'll tell you a little bit more about their story later, but what they did is take a look at their internal operations and structure and also their culture. And I want to share with you today that I think the two keys to sort of creating a really great learning practice in your organization is practice and culture. So let me break those terms down for you a little bit. What I mean by practice is fairly straightforward. It just means a process by which folks in your organization are capturing information, they're sharing information across your organization and even with folks outside, and they're using that information to make decisions. So it's pretty straightforward. It's a process. Also, it could be a systems. It could be some kind of technology like database, internal communication systems to share what's going on. So that's what I mean by practice. And I'll get back to kind of some details there. What I mean by culture, it's a little bit more of an abstract concept, but I think is really critical. What I mean by culture is the sort of enabling environment around the process within your organization. Culture is sort of the shared values and norms and behaviors that dictate how you work with each other. Essentially, it could be, it could even sort of go down into what you wear on a daily basis. So culture is sort of what's around you as you do your work. So, got a little analogy for you here today. If you think about learning as a big, delicious loaf of bread, and it could be gluten-free or regular bread, practice is just the steps in the ingredient, in the recipe that you take. It's just the steps that you go through. Culture is one of the main ingredients, and I'm going to share with you why I think it is the most important ingredient for learning, in that it is kind of the binding agent. It's the egg. It's like what keeps everything together. So back to Winthrop Rockefeller. So the foundation actually participated in a program called the Change Incubator, and Grant Makers for Effective Organizations offered this program to foundations. And through that sort of self-exploration, The team identified that there were elements of the internal operations and of their culture that were holding them back. They had a great culture, but they did a little bit of digging in into what was going on with their learning, and they realized that there were some things that were holding them back. And so what they decided to do is focus on three things. And this was their three things. It's not everybody's three things, but it was the foundation's three things. And they decided to focus more on how to bring data into everyday decision making. They spent some time thinking about what's a system, what's a platform that we could use, because it is so important to us to bring grantee and community members' feedback into what we're doing. So they thought about that, and they thought very deeply about how to shift the culture to make more iterative learning, more adaptation, the norm rather than the luxury that it often can seem like. They also restructured their team, so they made an existing staff person responsible for kind of holding up a mirror in the foundation and not only managing their data, but also organizing structured learning. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you could do that, no matter your size, no matter your resources, how you could think about embedding some of those practices. So in thinking about, very practically speaking, how you could incorporate new process and systems that make ongoing learning possible in your organization, there are a set of questions I think are really important to ask. I've done that with partners that we've worked with to really think through what should we be doing here. And those questions are, why? What's the purpose of what we're doing? Start with that, really important. What do we need the learning for? What are we going to do with it? I think this is a really big one. I might come back to this point a couple of times, but it's really important to think about when you're collecting information on people, who are they? What impact might that make on them? What could it mean to them that you're collecting information on how much they've accomplished, or what their mindset looks like, or what their health is like? So really think through who are you collecting information from, and who's going to use the information? Are the people who are going to use the information ready to take on that important responsibility? Obviously, how will you collect it? And how will you make sense of that information when you're together? Hopefully, it's a collective process. I would encourage that's really important in organizations, is to think about collective learning. So how are you going to make sense of that in order to think about what to do next time, how to shift, or how to keep going with a program if it's going really well? And last, when is the best time to implement learning? I think learning can happen anytime. I'm a big fan of learning, but realistically speaking, again, there are times where it makes more sense to try to bring in something new to an organization or modify what you're already doing. And given that culture change often is part of learning, becoming a learning organization, think about when the right time is to sort of introduce that into your organization. I want to tell you another story. I think this is an example of a partner we've worked with who have really deeply asked themselves these questions that I just shared with you. The Schott Foundation for Public Education is a charity. They are focused on ensuring that all kids, no matter their zip code and no matter their race, have equal access to high-quality public education. And Schott found itself in a similar position to Share Our Strength that I described earlier. It was successful in bringing coalitions of parents and community members to seek policy change in access to high-quality public education. It had a lot of success with bringing attention to issues around public education for black men and boys, and was making good progress. But it really strongly felt that the huge the magnitude of what they were trying to do relative to closing gaps in public education and in educational outcomes for kids was so big that they needed to shift how they approached it. And it was really, through that process of discovery, decided what we really need to do to make great change is to actually shift the narrative in educational outcomes from kids failing, teachers failing in the schoolroom to what is in the community around these kids and these families that is affecting their educational and life outcomes. Let's shift the narrative away from kids, especially kids of color, are failing, to communities around them need to bring greater love to them. And there's a fun story around the shift in the name. Originally it was called Healthy Living and Learning Initiative, And Dr. Jackson, who's the head of the Schott Foundation, who is an extremely inspiring, has been an inspiring partner to me, realized that what we're talking about here is bringing more love to kids, and through that process, they can have better educational and life outcomes. And so that's just a side story about the name, but I think it's really beautiful. So essentially, the narrative that they wanted to produce was to shift away from deficit conditions like graduation rates. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an important piece of data that people need to have in their pocket. They need to understand what's going on, but it's definitely not the whole story, and often those kinds of pieces of information are used as the whole story, but it doesn't get to the whole solution. So instead of that, the Schott Foundation looked at 10 cities across the United States, including Little Rock, and took account of 24 different indicators in these areas that are care, stability, commitment, and capacity to understand why we might be seeing educational outcomes for kids, and really focusing on those things as supports rather than as deficits in the community. Even more importantly, sort of extending the love analogy, Schott is being really careful with how that information was collected and then how it's shared back with communities. They're very sensitive about not just kind of coming in from the national perspective and laying it on cities and saying, okay, what are you going to do about this? They're really going through a dedicated process of collaborating with communities, asking how this can help them with their efforts across multiple kinds of organizations in those communities to improve educational outcomes for kids. I just want to note, this was a big move. This was like a go big or go home kind of effort. This is not necessarily the right thing for everybody, but it was just a beautiful example of how when you shift from just kind of assessment of deficit conditions to consideration of the broader environment and what we can do to make great change, this is where they have gone, and it is a continuing effort. So in addition to those why, what questions, I just want to share that I think in order for learning to be successful at an organization, you have to invest in people, systems, and time. I think that's the key to sustaining that practice. I'm curious, how many, just show of hands, how many people feel that learning and evaluation is well-resourced in their organizations? Wow, really? Woo, okay, so that's thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. So that's not a lot of you, and I get it. I've definitely been in the position of constrained resources, very significantly constrained resources, and I also get that most nonprofits are required to do evaluation by their funders, and a lot of research shows that even though foundations require their grantees to do evaluation, they don't fund it, which is a problem and needs to change. So that is real, and I know that, but I also really believe that there are ways to size investment for your organization, for your resource base, to incorporate learning and to focus on sort of people and process. And I mean, so think about, is there a person in your organization? If you don't have anyone responsible for learning and evaluation now, think about the possibility of someone like your development person or your communications person have a dedicated time devoted to bringing data in and helping team members make sense of what they see there. Think about, in terms of time, think about meetings. We all have meetings. We all probably have more meetings than we ever want to have. Think about the possibility of repurposing some of those meetings. You could have quarterly meetings that are focused on bringing in results of evaluations that you've had recently, and together as a team collectively making sense. There are ways to do that. Think about how you could create a book group that happens on a quarterly basis that brings in books that focus on advances in the field that you're working on. I truly believe that there are ways to bring learning into an organization, and it takes intentionality, and it takes another thing, a big thing, and that is culture. So I want you to imagine that you've gone through the process of figuring out, what do we need to do? What does our process look like? How can we use our systems to make learning possible? You've told the staff that we're doing this now, and you might even have hired someone to do it. And that person starts sharing information, and the information is not great. So just like share our strength, maybe the information tells you well, actually what we thought, the effect we thought we were having, we're not actually having. And maybe what we're doing is not being received well by the community, or people are having bad experiences. Now imagine that people on the team start pointing fingers at each other. They may be even pointing fingers at the community. That's rough. The reason that is probably happening is because there isn't a culture that's already been articulated. There aren't rules of engagement that say, we need to face the music, we need to kind of hear what these data say, and we need to reflect on it, we need to give ourselves time to do that, and then we need to give ourselves time to plan what's next. And so I think we, at Community Wealth Partners, we work with organizations on culture and culture change, and one of the visuals that we share with them is an iceberg, in addition to this pyramid. It's an iceberg, and it's sort of this idea that there's above the waterline, there are probably stated values. Most nonprofit organizations have a set of values that they want to live by. And they have some norms and sort of expectations. And then there's a lot more that's under the water, which is all the sort of unspoken parts of a culture that people don't talk about or they haven't talked about. And it really can affect how you deal with difficult information or even great information. So I say again that articulation, spending time on naming those norms and naming those rules of engagement is really critically important. Winthrop Rockefeller actually spent some time in trying to figure out, well, how can we shift our culture to make learning more successful here? And one of the things that they decided to do was to slow things down. Now, I understand that in nonprofits, you feel like you want to get information, you want to act on it, you want to act because people need your services or people need you to help them. So you can often kind of measure success by the pace at which you're getting things done and making changes. And the team at Winthrop Rockefeller realized that it really needed to give itself permission to slow down. And I would share that culture often is about permission giving. Culture change is about creating possibility in the space to do things differently. And so they gave themselves permission to slow way down and had created new kinds of some new meetings in which they would reflect and report to each other and really get on the same page with grantees as well, since that's a really big value for them. So while we know that as I said, we do work on culture and learning culture with organizations, and so we know that when you're naming rules of engagement, they need to be specific to your organization. It has to be meaningful to you. What I was just showing you here is an important norm that we often use when we're helping others develop a learning culture. This is a biggie. I'll talk about this in a minute, but usually the biggest problem is that failure is not okay. And when you're learning, failure has to be okay, or you don't learn anything and you don't progress. So this is just an example of an articulation of a norm, a rule of engagement, and a behavior that helps you demonstrate that failure is okay, which would be if you have bad information or bad outcomes, you share those along with the good. So I do think there are some common characteristics of organizations that have good learning culture, and those are first, that there has to be top-down and bottom-up championing of culture. We have found in our work that unless leadership in an organization gives permission to change culture and to embody that culture, it doesn't happen. People are waiting to hear a leader of an organization say, we're doing this now. So that's really important, and it has to be sustained championing over time or it doesn't work. But it also has to come from all levels of the organization. At Community Wealth Partners, when we focus very intentionally on culture, we actually have the entire team talk about what will be meaningful to us in terms of our named norms and behaviors. And so everybody has to be at the table there, and everybody then has to together mutually reinforce those norms and behaviors. What we have a saying at Community Wealth Partners: don't sugarcoat, because we have to be comfortable in saying, you're not living that norm of failure is okay. You're making me feel like I'm a failure because something I tried didn't work. So that's really critically important. Another one is failure is okay. And actually what I would suggest is that it's necessary. If you think about science, you can't figure out how would they have created the light bulb or anything that we have without trying things a lot of times and failing. So nothing really big, I would say, happens without without failure. So we need to get more comfortable with that in the social sector. I don't think we're very comfortable, and I know why. It's totally reasonable. We are often in the position of being judged by our donors maybe, or the public, or by our funders pretty consistently about, are you succeeding? And sharing failure, sharing something that didn't work feels very dangerous. But in fact, I would say you're not going to make the big impact that you really want to make without that. And ironically, that's even the case in foundations. We work with a lot of foundations as well, and it's really interesting that where those consequences are different, the stakes are a little different in foundations, and there's still a lot of kind of fear of admitting that something they tried didn't work. And so it sort of pervades our whole sector, but that really has to change, or we're not going to make the big difference we want to. Also, knowledge is power. So when more people have knowledge, there's a power balance that gets that is more healthy. People also engage more with information when they feel like they have it and they know what to do with it, rather than just sort of being handed it. And so I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of equity considerations when you're collecting information, when you're sharing information. So think about how knowledge is power in your organization. And last, stay curious. I love the museum. I haven't had a chance to go into the Museum of Discovery, but I love that there is a Museum of Discovery in Little Rock. So think about that. Like, be the Museum of Discovery in your organization. I really think it's curiosity and willingness to ask and consider difficult questions is sort of critical, especially in our world is changing all the time. And I really think it's critical for us to be able to continue to respond to that environment, just like Share Our Strength did, just like the Schott Foundation did, and say we are part of this universe. And if we're not asking questions about what's going on, then we're not changing with it. As I said, know your power. I think in particular grant makers with their grantees, that relationship, and also nonprofit organizations with their community members really understand now. There's a lot more understanding, there's a lot more discussion of the fact that a power dynamic gets created when you're in a role. When you're a grant maker, you're always in a more powerful role than that nonprofit. And also, if you're someone serving a person, or if you're working with a person, you're in a role that has power dynamics that you always need to be aware of. Well, when you're an evaluator, you are also in a position of power. When you're asking questions and you're judging and you're observing and you're assessing, you are in a position of power as well. And there are a lot of folks in the field are really starting to think more about what it means to have equity kind of front and center when you're in a learning or evaluation role. But I think that in particular is kind of key to using learning for good, not evil, to extend my metaphor. Great. Some big takeaways that I hope you take from this conversation. Lead with learning. Keep evaluation. Evaluation is critical. Other kinds of assessment is important. But if you lead with a learning orientation, you think about what that might mean for your organization, I think you'll have a whole different set of outcomes and probably a different kind of staff. When people feel like they're engaged in learning in some way that is realistic for their time and resources, they engage in the work differently. Be intentional about learning and evaluation by incorporating the two things that I talked about, culture and practice. Don't forget about culture. Don't forget about culture. I'll say it more times, culture. Ask the why, what, who, how, and when questions. Be realistic about what you can do with your resources and time, but also be ambitious, be optimistic, be hopeful about it. Because I don't think we can move on those big challenges we're working on without that optimism. And be responsible with learning and evaluation. Always think about who's on the other end of this question I'm asking. Think about whether you can bring those voices into your learning process. Our experience is that, just like Winthrop Rockefeller, the most learning organizations bring those stakeholders, bring those affected or those involved in your community into the process from the beginning, not at the end. Because what happens a lot of times with evaluation is, you realize, oh darn, 3 years later, I got to evaluate this project. And then you ask people to give you information. But if you brought them in at the beginning or even early in the process and to say, hey, we want to learn from this, how do you feel about it? Can you share your perspective with us now? It makes a huge difference. So I want to leave with a quote that I really like. One, I really like Jeffrey Canada, but of course I also love data. And what I like about this is that learning and evaluation can be really scary because we really put our heart and soul into our work, but we just need to remember the data itself is not the enemy. It can be a tool. So I'm going to read it out loud just because I like it so much. The data tell you an important story. We can't fall in love with our programs, we have to fall in love with our missions. And data is a tool to pursue our mission and adjust along the way. So think about data as your tool in your toolbox for social change. It is not the enemy, it is your friend. Thank you. I look forward to more conversation. How'd I do? Okay.
You can go to the forum. All right. Oh, is it on? Okay, good.
Testing.
All right. This part is what we call our Fireside Chat. We'll just have a little dialogue, so pretend this is a fireplace. And we're all just kind of having an informal conversation. And so I'm going to ask Rachel some questions. If you don't hear your question asked, then we'll open it up for Q&A a little bit more. So sound good? All right. Now, if I am a small nonprofit with limited resources, what does this look like in my organization without depleting the storehouse? What does that look
Got
like?
a clap over here. So what it looks like and what it has looked like for us when we've worked with organizations is, as much as possible, and it is possible to do this, use what exists already in the organization. As I mentioned, I think learning versus just evaluation is a mindset. I understand too that it's a practice, which means time thinking through that practice. But I think the importance is thinking through first, what do we have already that we're doing that could be used to support learning. And so the way we worked with organizations to do this is, very practically speaking, map out what's your planning process. Everybody has a planning process and a budgeting process. Everybody has regular meetings to determine how an organization is going to move through its programming for the year. If you can map on top of that the things that you can do to learn. So if you have existing evaluations, for example, if you're required to do an evaluation, right there you have a source of information. But if you can map on top of that the ways that you're going to collect information, again, I think it's likely, especially given development process, and so through fundraising and also through collecting information about folks you serve, you've got sources of information. But as I said, let me start again. So you sort of take your process that's already happening. Usually it's planning. You take the sources of information you know you're going to collect. You figure out what rhythm would make sense given your planning on a regular basis, how you can take that to sort of learn continuously and change. I think as part of a process, everybody's kind of always doing their programs. But I think it just has to do with incorporating in your meetings something as simple as a set of questions about what you're learning and how you need to improve. So when we've done it with folks, it's really been just a very practical process of looking at what exists and sometimes looking at what doesn't exist, and might be creating a new database for information, but as much as possible taking what's there and then adding on this mindset shift. Now that does, I think, take a different kind of time frame. To be realistic, if you feel that learning is not something that's valued in your organization, but you feel that there could be kind of a campaign to incorporate it, I think you have to expect that process of naming the norms and behaviors that I mentioned will take some time. It could take 6 months to a year to give yourselves time to have a few meetings to talk about it with the team, to really then roll it out, and then start living that. So to be realistic, there is time required. There doesn't always have to be extra things. There doesn't always have to be extra technology. There can be, and sometimes there does need to be, but it doesn't have to happen that way.
Okay, so we've talked about culture and practice, but evaluation is important too, the evaluation itself. So how do I know what kind of evaluation I need, and how can I get my funder to pay for it?
Oh, geez. Thanks. That's not a hard question at all. Well, I'm going to totally cop out and say that for evaluation, it depends. The answer is it depends on a lot of things. So it depends, the kind of evaluation you need would depend on where you are with a program. I'll just use program, it's sort of a generic term, but if you are creating something that's entirely new and you understand that in order for you to actually sort of track the development of that model, you might do something like a developmental evaluation, which just helps you understand how's it going as we go through this. If you are in the process of running you've done a year or two of a program, and you know that you need to report on how things are going, how sort of implementation is going, how the people participating in the program are experiencing the program, you might have to have something that's more of it's called a process evaluation or a formative evaluation, where you ask questions. You don't expect that you've got your long-term outcomes, but you want to understand, you want to look for indicators of how things are going. And then, of course, if you've had the 3-year experience, you know that most funders, and this is a challenge, most funders want to know what are the outcomes, like what are the big outcomes that you've had after a year. And I think probably everyone's had the experience where whatever they're working on, sure, you can look at like how things are going and what you're seeing, but the outcomes that you're working toward often take many years to find. And so there's always this sort of rush to have a big, what I would call a summative evaluation or an impact evaluation. And so I think the challenge is always in being really reasonable about what you expect to actually see after a period of time, trying to develop a relationship with a funder where they would understand that while you're tracking progress, you can't always track to those ultimate outcomes. And so I guess, again, the question is, it depends very much on the questions that I raised earlier, which is, what do you need to know? What are you trying to do? Where are you kind of in the life of what you're doing? But there are a lot. It's just important to know that there are a lot of other kinds of evaluation besides that big impact, that big outcomes evaluation. Developmental evaluation, you may have seen something about it, is new-ish and is really more about much more exploratory and doesn't always track to very specific standard metrics. It is a process by which you understand how something is going it's like you're testing the plane as you're flying it, so to speak. And it's a new tool that is accessible, I think, to many, and it's a method that you can read about anywhere online.
Okay, so let's talk about a real life scenario. Can you give me an example of how you've seen an organization operationalize this for themselves, how they made the shift into becoming a learner? Can you give us an example of how you've seen it happen?
Sure. In addition to some of the examples that I shared, I would say, so I would share with you that we're in the process now of working with a foundation that has a very specific goal, a very big goal that they've set for themselves, which is something we really believe in, to set big but achievable goals. And they are in this, I think, difficult position of both knowing that they need to learn internally. They have evaluations, but there's sort of not as much sharing internally of the information. And they also know that if they don't do it, they're not really likely to hit their goal. I mean, it's just it feels like a very urgent problem to them that the feedback loops that I described earlier, they know that they don't have them. So we're still in process, but what that process looks like with them is really mapping. When I say mapping, it's we're listing out what does your grant making process look like? What is the timeline of that grant making process? What are the meetings? What is the process by which you have to make decisions about where to invest? And so you could translate that to a nonprofit organization as well. It's sort of, when do you make decisions? What information do you need to make those decisions? And how do you find that information? And we sort of backtrack and we say, given what you need to do in the next year, we've literally created kind of a map for them. And a sort of set of agreements around meetings where they will take the information that they know that they're collecting on, in this case on grants, they will consider them and they will make decisions. They agree that they're going to make decisions. We've actually spent much more time with them on the culture because our experience is that is much less straightforward and much. It's much more difficult to talk about. Process is just process, So of course, again, realistically speaking, it's hard to change process. It takes resources, but it's really hard to talk about culture, especially culture that's not working. And so we spent much more time with them. And what that looks like is working with a team, and it's a pretty small foundation team, working with a select group of folks from some of the different departments, including the department that's responsible for learning and evaluation, but also including folks like in their grants management team and someone from their communications team, and actually having them articulate the rules that they think will change their culture. And we've successfully worked on culture in other organizations, and it takes hard work, and it takes, as I said, leadership championing and agreement, but it literally looks like a set of meetings where they name the norms, and then there will be a process of rolling it out with the team. And the test is time. We see, as I mentioned, we see that being successful where leadership gives permission for people to take time and space to do those things. Even if it's just a mindset change. Mindset change is really big, but it takes leadership championing to do that. And it really, the way you know it's happening is you give it 2 to 3 years and you actually see what's happening. But in the meantime, we arm people with a sort of ways to check each other, to mutually check each other and say, I don't think you're doing that. You're making me feel like it's not okay for me to give you feedback or to share that I learned from a community member that this happened in the program. And then if you don't make me feel like it's okay to do that, we're not learning together.
Okay. You just mentioned the feedback loops, and they were like the triangles, I think, on your slide.
Not loops, sorry.
Not loops, but triangles.
Geometrically.
What is the purpose of a feedback loop, and what do you do with it? How do you do a feedback loop?
Well, I would describe it at a basic level, a feedback loop is someone saying something and someone else listening, rather than someone saying something and someone else not listening or not absorbing what they're saying. And that happens a lot at organizations. A lot of information sharing is very one way. It's sort of, I'm reporting to you, here's my report, I'm done, and I'm sure, as a person in a nonprofit, I felt like this all the time, that I was doing reports or I was doing evaluations and I was handing it to someone and then it just went nowhere. That is not a feedback loop. That is a feedback black hole. And sadly, I think that does happen a lot. A feedback loop is again, as I said, is a process by which someone is sharing information and that person is absorbing it, reflecting, and often together then they're making decisions about how to use that. And so I would just suggest that if in a learning organization that the mindset is openness to actually taking all information. The trick is figuring out what are the parameters around how much information we're collecting, or what are we doing with it. You can get into crazy feedback loops where there's too much information. I've also seen that. And so you have to be pretty thoughtful about deciding what information is relevant. So again, kind of asking yourself the questions of what do we really need to know in order to make our best decisions, and connecting that process of talking and reflecting together, connecting it to what you're doing. So in other words, if there's a rhythm of a program where, you've started with a cohort of, this is totally generic, so sorry, but you started with a cohort of 25 people, and you know that 6 months before it ends, it will be really important for you to understand what's happened in order to figure out what the next cohort looks like. You have a set set way of getting information about that and sharing it within the organization, and then making decisions before the decisions are upon you. One reflection that I have is that we've often worked with organizations who want to improve learning, and they've actually said to us, we use information to rationalize decisions that are already being made rather than informing the decisions before they're made. And that's just a truth. And it's neither, it's not great, but I think that it's human nature, again, like we want to move, we want to be quick. And then you realize when someone questions you about that decision, you say, oh, well, let me see, I got some data here to show you. But it's really not a good way to learn carefully.
Okay, let's talk about the top-down, bottom-up concept. Tell me what you mean about that in the context of culture and practice.
Well, I think in most cases, unless you're truly working in a flat organization, which I've never worked in a flat organization, but in most organizations, leadership makes decisions about how we spend our time. Even if they ask you about it, usually they're decisions about how we spend our time, how we spend our money, what I do, what my role is. And they also set the culture of the organization. I think it's really hard for leaders to realize when they do a little diagnosis of their culture and they realize that it's not healthy or it's not productive for learning, to realize that that's where it's happening, that they are not creating a culture where people can do the things they need to do.
The leader, you mean?
The leader in the organization. It can be a really rough spot when we're working on culture. And so I think that what that means is usually that the work on new process and culture on learning needs to be initiated by leadership. I mean, it can, and that's difficult. It can come from, there could be cries for that. I mean, certainly from people at all levels of an organization, but the real investment of that time and resources has to come from leadership. And then what that looks like is once that decision has been made, it looks like having all members of a team be part of decision making around what the learning process will be and how the culture needs to change. And we just have found that if you're expected to do something and you're not sitting at a table where someone asks you, is this going to make sense for your work, then you're likely either to feel like you're just being told what to do unreasonably, or it won't make sense because nobody's asked you how you actually do your work. So it won't actually be reasonable the way you do it. So the impetus, the permission giving has to come from leadership, and the sustaining all of those decisions you've made has to be like continually championed by leadership, but it has to bubble up from everybody in an organization or it's not going to work at all.
They kind of reinforce those values.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop.
It's a feedback loop. Okay, feedback loop. All right. Then you said failure was so important. As a matter of fact, you said something like if there's not failure, either somebody's lying, or
we talked about that yesterday.
or you're not.
I forgot to say that today. I really like that.
Or you're not doing anything interesting.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right? Exactly.
So unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. No. So when Charlotte and I were talking yesterday, when we were talking about this idea of failure, I just mentioned that if somebody doesn't say at any time in an organization, this didn't work, it failed, then either somebody's lying or you're not doing anything interesting towards greater impact. And usually it is, lying is a very strong word, but usually it's because people do not feel safe saying this didn't work. It's very difficult because failure of an effort feels like personal failure when it's your job, and it also feels like organizational failure, and that feels very dangerous when you're in a funding environment. And so if you and at Community Wealth Partners, we work really hard on this. We actually we've had meetings where we've only talked about failures, or where we've talked about when things went catastrophically wrong and how we handled it. And you can make all of that really productive and fun. I mean, we've worked with organizations that literally had like a twice yearly fail fest, or like, you may have heard this concept of failing forward or failing fast, which is a little bit cliche, I think, but because it's very difficult to do that. But I think that there are efforts in a lot of organizations to make failure more okay by talking about it, right? It's when you talk about something, it takes away some of its power and some of its scariness. And so talking about even defining failure. So we actually, at Community Wealth Partners, we sort of said, well, what does failure mean for us as an organization? Like, what are we actually talking about when we say we failed? And then, how did we handle it? What did we do? Because you always learn, and you come back from it too. And so instituting practices around that just reinforce that you're not going to get fired, your kids are okay, those kinds of things. Your life isn't probably changing because something failed. You may feel really heartbroken by that because we all put a lot of soul into our work, but I think it's really about permission giving in an organization too, and it takes time. It really does take time. I mean, culture does not change quickly. It could take years, but it really and when the leadership is all in consistently, that is what makes the difference.
Okay, well, we have some time towards the end here. Are there questions from the audience? We can take questions or comments. We have a couple of microphones that are roving. Any questions for Rachel?
Learning and evaluation is a big topic. Did I really cover everything for you? Anything that you want to?
In a small nonprofit, a lot of data. But also in our small nonprofit, a lot of it is performance. So your experience in finding something, evaluating performance, that people that like to look at pie charts and graphs will accept.
When you use the word performance, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean? Do you mean performance of a program? Tell me what you mean by that. Do you mean literally performance of a person?
Yeah, let's go with that. Performance of someone's job. I think you did a good job, or something along that. Here are your goals, and I'm rating you of how well you did in achieving your goals. Because it's not just whether or not you achieved them, it's how well you achieved them. And so from a performance level, you're working with people that want concrete data. How do you give them that?
The reason I asked you about performance was, I think it's difficult to not feel like if something works or doesn't work, it actually is because of your performance. But a rule of evaluation is that you want to be able to determine causation, and in a lot of cases, when you are seeing the success or challenges of a program, there are so many reasons why these things happen. So I just pointed that out. That may not be an answer to your question, but I just wanted to point out that I think we need to really define what we mean by performance. I think you also had a question in there about when people just want hard facts, and that is meaningful to them, and that if there aren't those hard facts, it feels ambiguous, it feels unsatisfying. I agree, but I also, our experience has been that we almost never do any kind of evaluation that is only quantitative, where we're only collecting data and giving it back to someone, because it's really hard to make sense, especially with the kinds of efforts that we work on, where they're trying to solve hunger, they're trying to solve racism. It's like those are really big topics, and so without collecting more qualitative information, there's so much nuance to all of those things that we almost always bring stories or bring words, bring the sort of in-between concepts that you don't always get in pie charts. So while we're in that position, we do a lot of visualization, and people feel more comfortable with kind of quantitative data. I think it's really important to, as much as you can, find places where you can actually bring qualitative data. And what I mean by that is interview someone or ask them why this happened. Even use the data to say that, because we make a lot of assumptions when we see, like I was showing the graduation rates, you make a lot of assumptions based on what you see in those line graphs. But you need all of the things that are happening around it in order to do it. So I think and I'm sort of guessing here, so I'm sorry but I think the couple of things just that are important is to think about, like, how can we make connections with other kinds of information to make that data real for people? And then also, how do we really think about the true role of our organization, or me as a person, and what happened with that program? And it is, again, this goes back to culture and mindset. Performance is that's a tricky concept, and it's so hard in nonprofits because it's the targets. When you're working in a financial institution and you can say, yeah, this is the dollar figure, is so different in a nonprofit organization where you could, as I shared with Share Our Strength, you could be feeding a lot of kids and you're not actually making a difference. So on the flip side, when you use quantitative data and you say, look at all the things we did, and then you find out it's not working, there's a danger in that too. So I think I just laid more challenges on you than answers. I'm sorry.
Other questions? Other thoughts? Are there any people in the audience who are actually evaluators, just by show of hands, or primarily this is nonprofit leadership and practitioners? Okay.
I'm interested, maybe you could share your roles, because I think one of the points that I hoped came across is that everybody has involvement in sharing learning externally in an organization. So if you're on a program team, you have to know what's happening, and then to kind of give perspective on how to change programs. If you're in communications or marketing, you have to know how to use information. You have to sort of know the right way to communicate what's happening at the organization, or sometimes even when things go really wrong, you have to know very carefully how to say what happened. Development, super important for people in development to know what you've learned about what's happening in the organization. So show of hands, is anyone in, I would say, marketing and communications in a nonprofit?
We've got one. Mm-hmm.
How about program delivery? Okay, some more. And what about development, fundraising? Okay, got a few here. That's great.
Do you have any policy people?
Yeah, policy. I was thinking maybe it's policy advocates, yeah. Yeah, also really important, obviously, this is probably the kind of bread and butter of the work that you're doing is information. Yeah. Yeah, it's all about collective sharing of the information, so, yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's thank Rachel for her presentation.